Good morning, and thank you, Dr. Caudry. We're going to try and tackle something here that's a little bit maybe lighter in context, but I think really relevant and dovetails with a lot of what we've already heard this morning and the comments that Dr. Caudry just made. But you know, social media, as we know it, is this vast, ubiquitous item that is really kind of overwhelming when you think about it. I mean, personally, I think about it as the thing that my kids use. But the reality is quite something different. I'm going to try and convince you of that in the next few minutes. So I think we need to consider a couple of things. One is the patient really online and active in social media? And if so, what is it that we can learn from that? I think to just sort of set the table and the context a little bit, I'd like to just start with a question, if we may. So, which statement best reflects your current beliefs about the effect of the internet and social media on the delivery of healthcare in Canada? Just take a minute, please, and let us know what you think. So it seems that an overwhelming majority of you think that patients are in fact using the internet and social media and influencing the decisions about their health care. I think that's encouraging that we as an industry are starting to recognize this, and part of what my work is to really kind of listen to what those patients are saying, because I think it can have a vast influence in terms of how we operate as a pharmaceutical industry and those kinds of insights that we might potentially glean from what we hear. When I sort of set out to kind of describe all of this, the numbers are overwhelming, and we shouldn't be surprised. And if there's any sort of question about whether or not patients are online and social, I think we have to consider the numbers. Billion people with Facebook pages, 5,700 tweets per second. There's 240 million people on LinkedIn, and the stats go on and on and on. It's a very compelling and I think I think speaks to the current and contemporary thinking around what social media really represents. Should we be surprised, or should we believe perhaps that patients are part of that mix? Are patients actually going there? And there's lots of data, and as I've learned recently and over this past several months, is it's changing constantly. But the fact is that the data that we have available to us indicates an overwhelming majority of patients, that is healthcare seekers, are online and they are social. So in fact, 86% of patients are seeking healthcare information on the internet. We shouldn't be surprised by that when we consider that probably any one of us that's had any kind of affliction or concern about our health, the first thing we've done is consulted Dr. Google. And I think that there's a number of indicators that we can garner from that, or a number of findings that we can learn from that to affect our perceptions about what patients think. 42% have used social media to find out information about their condition. I think this is really kind of an interesting stat, and I really think it's understated. But the fact is that patients are going and listening to their friends and consulting with their peer group about their healthcare conditions, perhaps even in advance of consulting a professional. And I think, again, those trends are really going north very, very quickly. 50% of patients who use the internet to self-diagnose. This might be a scary fact for a lot of healthcare providers. I mean, with 50% of people going online, Dr. Google, consulting it, what that implies is that there's going to be a lot of challenges for that healthcare provider when they have to spend their consulting time to actually address what the patient believes they have, as opposed to actually going through the diagnosis. So there's time constraint challenges and so forth. 25% have discussed a healthcare experience. It's not something I've done, but the reality is that the new generation, and this is particularly, we see this in the younger set, that 25% of them are actually going on there and telling about their experience, whether it be with a drug therapy or with any other type of device or similar. 20% have joined a healthcare forum. This is their opportunity to talk with like-minded people, and share their experiences. So I think, when we consider the paradigm shift that is really occurring in front of us, vis-a-vis how social media and how the internet and so forth are used, one of the considerations that we have to really take into this is that consumers in the healthcare context is the patient. And that amount of information that's available to them, whether it's factually correct or not, really puts them at the center. And they are the ones that are responsible now and empowering themselves to be able to make decisions. They have, as alluded to earlier, they have a lot of self-diagnostic tools, and they have a lot of information available through Dr. Google, and they also, the sheer internet of things, which is all things online. The patient is at the center, and I think that that's something that will really kind of drive the way we as marketers in the healthcare industry need to consider going forward. One of the things we tried to look at recently was, just how this affects, is there a particular instance that we could draw to and sort of see how this affects different patients? Some of you may be aware that of a specific instance where someone who's well known to us, depending upon your loyalties in hockey and so forth, would be familiar with Mr. Melnick's plea through social media to seek a new liver. He was quite successful at this, but I think this is a clear indication of what the power of the social media is, and ultimately how patients are taking that ability and that empowerment and driving their own outcomes. What Mr. Melnick did was he made a plea going back in May through social media, through the Ottawa Senators and so forth. And what happened was very rapid, and what he was able to do was, from that point, he was discharged successfully with a new liver on June the 3rd. There were some fascinating findings from this case study. You consider there were 500 people that came forth and said they were willing to give him a liver. And so these are living donors. But what is striking and remarkable is that only 5% of them said that they would give their liver to anyone else. So there is, a lot of information there that sort of says, social media was great for Mr. Melnick. He was able to secure a new liver. That's great. But in terms of driving new liver donations, I don't think it was so successful. And so I think that this really kind of, when we consider how the patient is now impacting their own outcomes and how they're using the media that's available to them, this is one good example of how they can be very, very successful at that. The data was pretty overwhelming, and I think this speaks to sort of the contemporary practices of what happens in social media, I should say. There was a huge bolus of information that went out initially, and there was a ton of retweets. A lot of it came through the CBC and through traditional media, but there was retweets of it. So the numbers were, sort of 12,000 north of over that whole 3-week period. But what we ended up seeing was, there's an estimate of the overall impressions of north of 163 million. There's other examples in the transplant area where people have done so. A gentleman in Belgium was able to get a kidney in 5 days. This speaks again and again to not only the power of what social media can bring, but how we as patients can ultimately affect our own outcomes using the tools that are available to us today. So I think that the numbers being what they are, were pretty powerful. What was interesting too is that most people preferred to share very positive things. There was an unfortunate kind of negative context to some of them, but most of it was pretty positive. There was also some interesting debate about the policy side of things, and this is really fascinating to me because we touch on policy in so many other contexts, but the idea that somebody could solicit and potentially gain a new organ by using social media, and the question came out of social media about whether or not he was conferred, that is, Mr. Melnick was conferred some type of advantage because of his status or because of his resources. And I think that's a challenge that we're going to see continually, and also I think in policy context this is going to come up repeatedly. So the issue did help raise the awareness, as I noted a moment ago, but it didn't actually seem to have any real beneficial effect on actually increasing the number of donations or donors. So that's a very brief kind of overview of a particular case, but what I'm interested in is, how do you interpret this policy matter with respect to Mr. Melnick, and did he actually receive some type of preferential treatment? So like social media, this is our opportunity to weigh in on the discussion. So the question is no, he didn't actually benefit from this. He did what any one of us would have done in this room to save his own life. But there's also the consideration that maybe it wasn't fair to people who don't have his celebrity or resources. But also, yeah, he did get a preferential advantage because he jumped the queue, and compared to other people who've been waiting for months and years to get an organ donation. So I'd like to hear what your opinions are on that. Very cool. Perhaps not what I expected, but it seems fairly spread out, although the majority think he did get some type of advantage over the folks that have been waiting. I think the point that we're trying to illustrate here is that through social media, policies around healthcare are going to be debated, and they're going to be debated in the public forum that is social media. And I think as industry folks, I think it behooves us to kind of weigh into these, or at least consider this type of thing. But it underscores as well the fact that there is an enormous amount of influence that the patient does have over everything. So I think, in summary, I wanted to sort of point out that the internet and social media have, in fact, changed the way we exchange information. The patient is the patient, and they are online and they are social. But more importantly, they're really empowered to do a lot of different things, as we saw with just one example. But that empowerment is really what's going to drive their behaviors going forward. Patients are demanding information, and they're influencing their outcomes. They're taking charge of their own health care. And we're seeing it again and again, and this was just one example, but I think we could provide you with a number of other examples that show how they're doing it on a more daily and ongoing basis. Thanks for your time.